For me, you know, I kind of feel like in this story, just to get close to Bertie as a stammerer is to encounter huge drama. But then in this story, what makes it extraordinary is you have these added dimensions. It's not just the story of a stammerer, a private individual. It's a stammerer who's forced to become King of England right when radio is taken on as a mass medium and the Second World War is approaching, which, as a stammering story, is about as extreme as you can possibly get.
And also, there's a fantastic little subculture going on here where you have a very high class, clearly very high class Brit, and a very middle class Aussie. And I understand that describes your parents.
I'm not sure my mum would appreciate the class distinction, but no. I mean, I'm the son of an Australian mother and an English father, and I grew up in London. And one of the things that makes this film very personal for me is kind of one of the narratives of my childhood growing up was my Australian mother unpacking the effects on my father of his upbringing. Because my father lost his father in the war aged 3 and was packed off to full-time boarding school at the age of 5, and it was that kind of brutal era of, you know, 5-mile runs before 6 AM, even in the middle of winter, cold baths, even in the middle of winter, corporal punishment, all those things that were meant to make Englishmen strong. And I was incredibly fortunate to have a mother who didn't come from that background and therefore made it very public within the family that this must have had an effect on my dad, and she worked at it, and you know, all I can say is I know a thing or two about an Aussie dealing with an Englishman's childhood from my own experience. So for me, the attraction of the story was a chance to talk about this very specific cultural exchange between, you know, Australia and the English energies, which I'd grown up with through these wonderful characters.
And did you enhance that when you came to the project? Did you bring more of that kind of culture clash into it?
Yes, I think actually, oddly, I mean, and Jeffrey Rush and I have spoken about this. One of the things, because of our Australian connections, is that we didn't want to fall into the trap of making the film, you know, Crocodile Dundee meets the King of England. And the script I started with was a little bit, you know, the Australian character was quite a lot broader. And Jeffrey very early on said, I don't want to make Yob versus Snob. And I think Jeffrey, you know, I think one of the risks if you had a non-Australian actor or a director that didn't have an Australian side to him is that you would be so worried about saying, oh, but is he Australian enough? And you'd end up over-pronouncing his Australianness, and you could end up with quite a crass stereotype. And you know, Jeffrey, of course, understands that there are incredibly quite sophisticated and cultured people coming out of Australia in that era. I mean, think of the sophistication of, you know, Barry Humphries, who plays Dame Edna Edridge, who's a brilliant comedian. And he wanted to kind of capture, you know, I think he wanted to capture that. And what's so clever about Logue is he kind of deploys crassness almost as a matter of manipulation strategy, as opposed to, you know, ignorant accident. Yeah.
And then you had all of Logue's journals to work with when creating this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this production has lots of luck keeps playing a part in this production in ways that, as a director and therefore natural control freak, is quite disturbing to me. There was, you know, that we had a recent bit of luck because apparently 2 people got engaged recently who were members of the royal family, which you may have heard of. But no, 9 weeks before the shoot, we discovered through my wonderful production designer Eve Stewart that the grandson of Lionel Logue, who was living 10 minutes away from me in London, had in his possession a set of handwritten diaries written by his grandfather, chronicling the relationship between the king and his grandfather. So 9 weeks before the shoot, we discovered this treasure trove of information that no royal historian has ever read, no biographer has ever seen, no member of the royal family has ever had access to, and I was literally the first person apart from the family that had it in my hands. And so we set about with 9 weeks to go, furiously rewriting the script to make it, to get the best out of it. Some of the best lines in the movie, strictly speaking, are written by King George VI and Lionel Logue. So, for example, at the end of the big speech, Lionel turns to the king and says, "You still stammered on the W." And the king says, "Well, I had to throw in a few so they knew it was me." That was, those lines were last spoken out loud by King George VI and Lionel Logue in 1939. And what's wonderful, not only did they go, you know, there's some nice snippets of dialogue, is that exchange confirms that the king is witty and he's clever, because that's a clever man comes up with that line. And some of the books about King George VI, they're so prejudiced by his stammer, they describe him as the dull, slow-witted one. And the diary brought to life a man who did have tremendous wit, and it confirmed David Sider's original instinct that there was wit in this relationship, and it also emboldened us to find more wit in the relationship, because that was clearly a flavour to it. I mean, the other thing that came out of the diaries is that on the day after the Second World War was declared, the Times ran the headline about the war being declared, and in true English repressed fashion, news of the outbreak of the Second World War made page 8. And on page 8 of the Times there was this big picture of the King in his naval uniform sitting down at a big desk with big ornate microphones in a very ornate room reading the King's speech. Now it's only because of the diaries that we know this is a fabrication, because we know from the diaries that Loeb had found this little back room which he dressed in a rather eccentric way to make it cheerful. He found an old school desk in the basement of the palace which he'd hammered some wooden struts into to make it high enough so Bertie could stand. And we know that Bertie stood with his jacket off, with his tie loose and with the window open, very counterintuitively for the radio. And it was just one-on-one with Loeb, and this image, this grand image of a man sitting at a commanding desk is complete nonsense. And so that was, there were wonderful physical clues in the diaries as well, which give us the nice sense of the film of sort of going behind the cliche.
And you're revealing a lot of things about the royal family and their relationships with one another, especially the brother relationship and with the parents. Was there any pushback on that? And can you speak a little about the 30-year wait to make the movie?
The story, David first set about wanting to write this just after, I'll go back even further actually. Because the story of how this film came to be really starts in the Second World War with a small boy who had a dreadful stammer, and this little boy used to listen to King George VI on the radio and think, if the King of England can cope, maybe there's hope for me. That little boy listening to the radio in the war is the writer of the movie, David Sider. King George VI was his sort of boyhood hero, his inspiration, his guiding light, and when he became a writer, he dreamed of writing about King George VI. And it was only after he wrote Tucker for Francis Ford Coppola that he felt he could turn to his passion project, kind of rather naively thinking that that was the way Hollywood worked. He began to research the story and found these blips on the radar of Lionel Loeb, Australian speech therapist to the King, which had really intrigued him. And he tracked down Valentine Loeb, who was the son of Lionel, who revealed that he had these diaries intact. So David knew about them years ago, but said, you can't read them unless you get permission from the palace. And so David wrote to the Queen Mother asking permission, and the Queen Mother wrote back and said, yes, but please, not in my lifetime. The memories of these events are still too painful. And David, being British by birth and never a good loyal subject, waited, little realising the Queen Mother was going to live to 186.
They are moving. I also understand this film had a rarity in all of filmmaking, which is a 3-week rehearsal process. After which you came out of referring to the actors as your storytelling partners. What changed and what developed and what came out of that rehearsal process?
I think only in a Q&A in Los Angeles can people be genuinely excited to discover that the director had a 3-week rehearsal. It's great. No, it's very. Colin Firth and Geoffrey Rush turned out to be not only fiercely bright but fiercely good on script, and they became real partners in the rewriting process with David and just making sure that the script was as sharp as possible. One of the reasons those scenes between the two men play so well, I think, was a testament to Colin and Geoffrey's taste about dialogue as well. And little things change, like that when Lionel says, "Do you know any jokes?" and Colin says, "Timing isn't my strong suit." That was a Colin Firth suggestion, which is very, very funny.